Hello, welcome to 775 Alive. I'm Scott Gaborski.
I'm Crystal Newton.
And we're joining you once again. Got a nice shot here of one of our historical register places here in the 775. This is actually the post office in Lovelock, Nevada, Pershing County.
Mm-hmm. Just below us.
Just below
me, I should say.
You there in Humboldt County on I-80. And we'll get to a minute why we're reporting this, but this was built in 38 here by the Works Progress Administration during the New Deal. And inside, it also has this wonderful mural that was done about the discovery of the Comstock lode, which is, of course, the first big silver deposit here.
Kicked off
Nevada, done by Inyar Hansen, right, as part of the Federal Works Administration project, which was an effort to employ artists and writers and others here as part of the New Deal. We wanted to show you this because we do have a lot of these types of buildings here throughout the 775, but more importantly, you wanted to talk about DOGE today.
We are. We're going to talk about DOGE. We're going to talk about government efficiency, and public works projects are indeed funded by the federal government and put out there by the federal government. So the conversation around DOGE really comes down to projects like these. Do we want them? Do we need them? Is it the right time? Mm-hmm. Obviously, a lot of people are really upset about DOGE, and we're trying to figure out why. So we're going to cover a lot of topics on DOGE today. But first, coming up in a few days, we're going to have a special election. Two, yes. And so this is going to happen on the U.S. congressional level.
Right.
And I brought it up because I was interested in your thoughts on how much this election is going to be public commentary on what Trump's done in his administration so far. We've got 2 months. Let's see how the people feel and think. But what's the playbook? What's the field look like right now?
Just for those of you who haven't been playing along at home because you're not political junkies like we are, we mentioned this a little bit that, of course, right now, the Republicans have a very thin lead here in the House, 218 to 213, with 4 seats currently vacant. There's 2 Republican seats that were vacated very early in this Congress, one by Matt Gaetz, the other by Michael Waltz when he jumped over to become National Security Advisor. Those are the elections that are happening this Tuesday because they're both in Florida.
Yes.
Right. So Gaetz had won the election back in November in District 1, which is the western side of the Florida Panhandle. This is where Eglin Air Force Base is and Naval Air Station Pensacola. So big military presence. Mike Waltz had won the election in District 6, which is on the other side of the state, the Atlantic coast, Daytona Beach. Right, is where his district is.
So essentially what you're saying is these are districts where they're likely to be a Republican replacing them.
Yeah, they won handily. And in fact, both Gaetz and Waltz actually outscored Trump by a couple percentages. But most of those went two-thirds towards Republicans this last election.
And strategically, I mean, it wouldn't have been wise for Trump to pull someone out of the House that had a seat that was vulnerable to a Democrat taking it out.
And there's a lot of worry because one of the things we saw this week is the Trump administration withdrew Elise Stefanik's confirmation hearing for UN ambassador out of fear what might happen in the Pennsylvania election a couple of weeks ago, special election. Although this didn't directly impact the House, it really caught the Republicans off guard because they thought they had it, and the Republican candidate lost by 400 and some odd votes. Right, so it was a very narrow thing. I actually don't think either of these races are going to go towards the Democrat. Of course, we've seen AOC and other Democratic luminaries out there promoting them as a referendum on Trump. But geez, both of these would have to flip on the order of 18%. I don't see it.
I don't see it either. But if it were to happen, would you consider that a complete rebuke of the first 2 months of the administration? I hate to play devil's advocate. It's not what I'm rooting for, folks. I'm just curious what this election will say.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are looking at it for that. I don't think this is probably a good test. Let me rephrase that.
Just fun for the news media to say.
No. If there is a Democratic victory, I think they're going to have to look at it seriously as a potential rebuke of the Trump administration. Yeah. If it's a Republican victory, it doesn't say anything because, again, the both of these areas. Well, District 1's 55% registration Republican, and District 6 is 49%, I think. So both of them are, and Democrats are in the 20s in both of those. So we would basically need to see Republican turnout half of what's expected before the Democrats even have an edge up, and I just don't see that happening, right?
Well, I mean, when we covered the elections, I was when we were talking about the red wave, I pointed out that the danger in a sweeping victory is that people feel very confident.
Right.
So what you just said right there is the one thing that I am worried about. The Republicans are so confident in their lead that they may not come out to participate.
Yeah, except I don't really think that's going to be the case, because
it's not really in a Republican's character to do.
And I do think there is a tendency for Republicans to vote more often in these sort of special or off cycle elections.
Okay.
Right. But again, I think what we saw in Pennsylvania, I think anybody that really looked at that Pennsylvania race, I mean, Pennsylvania was in, 3, 4, 5 percentage points. That's a little different than what we're seeing here. I mean, when you talk an 18% swing, that's a massive, massive swing over, basically 4 months. I just don't see it happening. But
yeah, I don't either, but we'll see how that plays out. Yeah. And that, I mean, I really do see that as just deeply intertwined with DOGE. And I've actually been very surprised to see the resistance to essentially a group of people. And I'm a business person, so I understand business people, I think, better than the average person. When I see the DOGE team, this is exactly what you would do with any kind of business that's struggling, is you come in, you go through all the books, you look at where everything's being spent, see where you can cut, especially if you're way over leveraged in your debt. This is standard operating procedure to me. So it's been shocking to me, and Elon Musk has stated publicly it's shocking to him. It's kind of mind-boggling to watch the pushback and the fear that's happening in the country, being pushed mainly by the Democratic Party. And I can see them trying to push back in any way that they can. But I am a little flummoxed at just how up in arms people have gotten.
Right.
So I did want to start out this conversation, not with the DOGE team that's in place today, but kind of bureaucracy over time, because it's such a prevalent thing. It's pervasive over history for thousands of years. It's been a problem, and we have to continually work at it to keep your government honest.
Right. Well, and I think there's a couple of things that flow into that before we even get to the history. One, it's sort of a constant to hate bureaucracies, right? I remember, this is my geeky side. Back in the 80s, there was a Star Trek novel I remember reading called The Wounded Sky. And, so there's this scene where Captain Kirk is having a conversation with this totally non-human alien engineer. And they're talking about these cultural things. And Kirk makes the point that, Starfleet Academy tells us when we're dealing with alien species to never ask about religion and sex. They're taboo topics. And this alien responds, well, our academy tells us to never talk to humans about death and taxes. Right. So there's, even in the far future, apparently we're going to be screaming about taxes and government efficiency. Bureaucracy is something that's been very, very tense throughout history. Although I would think Francis Fukuyama, one of the things he got right in his recent sort of 2-volume set on political order is really only before the 19th century. It was really only China that had what we would think of as a modern bureaucracy, right? I mean, people hated government officials, but a bureaucracy, in a sense, I think was something different.
Yeah, well, I mean, basically, to me, anytime you get a collection of people in power, in control of money, they're going to do everything they can to secure their position. And that's how you start to see the buildup. No matter what you do, whether you form a new country or you overthrow an old country, there's always a group of people that are trying to maintain their power and control. And most of the time that winds up in a behavior pattern of growing your control, because you feel like the bigger your control is, the more you can lose, you can afford to lose. So this continual expansion outwards of trying to get more and more power. And it does require a system of checks and balances, which our founders have implemented in this country. But still, the smart and the powerful always find a workaround. Water always seeks its own level.
Well,
so it is that's fundamentally what we're dealing with. Is anytime human beings get power, this is what happens, and we do have to address it.
Yeah. Well, although I will point out, I think there's a complicating factor, is that there's a difference between people who hold power and a bureaucracy. Okay. So you're constantly asking me weird snippets about Roman history.
I do.
So here's one. I mean, one of the surprising things, I mentioned Fukuyama, he calls China the precociously modern bureaucracy. And he's talking about the bureaucracy that really emerges with the Han dynasties around the year 0 AD, Common Era CE, whatever. So this is coterminous with Rome, which doesn't really have a bureaucracy under the Roman Republic. A lot of the powers we assume to bureaucracy is actually being handled by the men, and it is at this period all men, who are dominating the Roman offices, the aedils, the praetors, the consuls, proconsuls, whatever. These guys are actually staffing whatever bureaucracy exists. And in fact, the Roman system, what's sometimes called the cursus honorum, or the ladder of offices, is this is the progression of offices you hold. One of the things about that's fascinating is that this progression of offices really gives these men at each stage very deep understanding of the inner workings of the Roman government.
Mm-hmm.
So you usually start as a military tribune. At the bottom of this ladder, you'd be in your late 20s, but your charge is really sort of managing the payroll and logistics for the army.
Mm-hmm.
And then the next one's the Aedile. You're dealing with stuff such as, public works projects, public financing, the praetor positions.
So essentially, the Roman government used multiple spheres of people to act as their intermediaries throughout the empire.
Well, it's
like an administration.
No, it's not an administration. It's sort of direct power. That's one of the problems. The Roman Republic, as we think about it, which again is one of the models that the founding fathers used for the Constitution, right?
Right.
It really is personal power. They are successful in creating generation after generation after generation of leaders who could really solve the problems the Roman Republic is facing. Right. But they do become embedded in a power structure that eventually falls to personal ambitions.
Mm-hmm.
Right. But how it would work if how they would win votes, that is the Roman officials, might be something like your neighbor has a problem with another neighbor. You're running for a certain office. Hey, why don't I go ahead and, act as your lawyer on behalf of a law case, or sort of look into this issue if you vote for me?
Uh-huh.
So it's a scratch my back and I'll scratch your situation.
An in-kind donation is what we would call it today.
Well, very much so. We call this outright corruption, right? I mean, in some ways, the Roman Republic's a giant
potato.
I used to joke with my students. I call the Roman Republic it's an olive oil republic, like
Mm-hmm.
a banana republic, just with olives, right?
I think anytime someone uses the term bureaucracy, there's kind of an underpinning of corruption intertwined with that, don't you think? No one's ever like, oh, the great bureaucracy. It's always like the bureaucracy.
Well, but that's the interesting thing, is that Rome doesn't have a bureaucracy until very late.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really after the crisis of the 3rd century that particularly under Diocletian, that we start seeing the formation of a bureaucracy in our modern sense. It never takes 100% hold. But he's engaged in stuff like, to recover the Roman economy, he gets a bureaucracy to try to set maximum prices across the empire.
Price fixing.
Price control, right?
They've been doing this stuff forever, folks.
They've been doing it forever. And we have the list, this is how much each grade of horse, for instance, or, Rome's a slave society. So here's what each grade of slave should cost the empire. He passes laws to do stuff like try to ensure that the eldest son goes into his father's profession,
Mm-hmm.
to prevent this hollowing out of urban infrastructure. And it doesn't work. I mean, Rome just doesn't have the wherewithal and the manpower to try to control their economy on this thing. And really the only thing two aspects of this actually survive that might be of interest to you. One, Rome goes as far as to devise a specific kind of building to put this bureaucracy in.
Right.
Right. You know what it's called?
Pantheon?
Nope. Close. Right. Basilica. This is where basilica comes from. They were large buildings where all these bureaucrats would be operating, and they normally had the elevated clear stories, the elevated windows. Well, when Christianity gets established, these are some of the largest structures where you can have indoor religious services, which hadn't been part of the ancient world. So basically, the Catholic Church ends up picking up the Roman bureaucratic building style and the structure. That's where a diocese comes from. The concept of the diocese is really set up by Diocletian to allow this bureaucracy to function.
Yeah.
And then the church under Constantine picks it up.
And back then, the church and the government, I mean, there were almost two flavors of the same entity. It's, the religious really had a lot to do with infrastructure and community. And so those two were kind of interchangeable. So the idea that one would use the other's infrastructure completely makes sense.
Well, that was Constantine's goal, right? That's not how it turned out to be that reason for other reasons. Basically, the church continues where Rome collapses. But anyway, so why I bring up this issue is I think it's important. One of the problems I think we're having is that you're talking about this situation where it's people wanting to hold on to power. And you're absolutely right? I mean, any type of government or human institution has people behind it. But a bureaucracy is something different. Bureaucracy really should be devoted to processes in an effort to solve corruption. The question always becomes, at what point do those two become indistinguishable? And I think one of the things DOGE is uncovering is that we might be at that point now, right?
Yeah, to me, a bureaucracy is basically a distribution of entities that are profiting off the government spending money. So the government can't directly spend money in most cases. So today, and what I imagined what was happening in the Roman Empire was you had representatives. Today we call them senators. They might have called them senators back then too.
Senators were something else. And
Okay.
Let's not. We're getting off on this. Don't get bound up too much in Rome. But
I mean, to help people visualize what a bureaucracy is essentially you have these second and third and fourth kind of they're kind of fourth degree removals from the government, and they're given money to go take care of something that the government wants done. And what happens is every time that money gets passed through, somebody will take a piece of it, and they'll also take a piece of power that comes with it, because there's a lot of power that comes with handing out money. You know, you get to be the one that chooses. Everyone's vying to be the person that gets chosen. It puts you in a position of power. And so to me, what a bureaucracy is a whole group of these people going out, taking a chunk for themselves, leveraging that chunk of money for their own personal power. And that would be that sphere that surrounds the government that has just as much power, I think.
Well,
that's how I visualize a bureaucracy.
Well, and first I would say that's a very cynical view.
Thank you.
Not that it's necessarily wrong.
I am cynical.
But it is a very cynical view.
Let's just say pragmatic.
Well, the bureaucracies are designed supposedly to provide services.
Yes.
Right. And this is one of the issues. And you're right. You always have a bureaucracy because, you know, it's not like a president is going out and doing X, Y, and Z. Right. So you don't want, for instance, one of our first departments after Treasury and State and the Army, right, which then would have been the Department of War that's set up in the Constitution. One of the first ones is actually the Navy, when the U.S. gets involved in this, what's called the quasi-war with France in the 1790s. But what's interesting about that is, you know, you can't imagine somebody like George Washington going out and deciding, you know, what type of rope should we buy for a new Navy ship? That's where the bureaucracy comes in, right? You want some experts to do this. And where the U.S. has actually had a long problem with this, and we're seeing this come up a lot, I think, is how you exercise control over the bureaucracy.
Yes.
So Congress has control of the money. Issue number one, right? That's clearly stated in the Constitution, with the proviso, which I think is something we can come back to with this DOGE discussion, that, you know, those books be open in public, right? I mean, it's in Article 1 of the Constitution. Any money spent out of the Treasury approved by Congress has to be subject to public review. But you also have this very long history where a lot of these bureaucratic positions early on were used for patronage appointments, right? That is somebody who comes in as a president and is putting people in these positions to assert their policies. Sound familiar?
Yeah.
Yeah. And in fact, this is one of the things that leads to Marbury versus Madison, which is really the basis for how we think the judiciary operates today. But so basically what happens is that Adams, who is no friend of Jefferson and absolutely, for lack of a better term, pissed that he loses the election of 1800, makes a lot of midnight appointments to Attorney General. One of these happens to be Marbury. Madison comes in as under Jefferson and tries to stop these midnight appointments. And this goes all the way to the Supreme Court. And nobody remembers what the actual decision on the case was. What everybody remembers is the judicial decision by the justice at the time that, you know, the Supreme Court has the power to declare laws constitutional or not. Right. After now they have to reach the court. That's something a lot of people forget. It doesn't automatically happen.
Right.
But that is an early example of where bureaucracy and politics intertwining has caused problems. And again, Andrew Jackson, there's a reason Trump talked a lot about Andrew Jackson. He launches a big campaign to make sure his supporters are put into the bureaucracy, right? Getting rid of the so-called spoils system. From him, really, a lot of people use the satirical press against him, the Whig press, accused him of arguing to the victor go the spoils. Right, I won the election, therefore I can appoint whoever I want to these positions. And this becomes a major problem over the 19th century until really the 1880s, when the idea of the modern civil service, right, that the bureaucracy is going to be nonpartisan professionals who serve whoever the administration is. Now, cabinet officers would get appointed,
right,
but the bureaucracy itself would be nonpartisan. And well, of course, President Garfield is assassinated by a guy that, frankly, is probably not not the most sane person. But what he's upset about and why he targets at Garfield is he's been denied a civil service position.
Yeah. And you can imagine just how much, well, we both had a fair amount of interaction with politicians, and we understand the political apparatus quite well, I think. And they're under quite a bit of a spotlight, and they are subject to a lot of investigation and overview and review. And so there's another kind of more, forgive me, I'm being cynical again, but when you're in a position of power like that and you want to do certain things that would be scrutinized, or maybe you don't want people to know you're doing, that bureaucracy is where you turn to. You're friends with independent businesses that can be contracted to carry out certain things. So those NGOs are, up until modern, like Trump getting elected, up until then, they've been operating largely in the dark. Nobody's known who they are, what they're spending money on. It was obvious it's publicly available, but who goes and looks at that? Right. So, I mean, up until now, it's really been kind of this shadow, almost government, where politicians can turn and hand out power and influence to go do the things that they can't do.
Well, but I'm not sure that's how the system was set up to function.
It's not. But I do want to say, though, I think at the heart of the Republican Party is there's an acknowledgement that this does happen and there's no way to stop it. But what you can do is limit the size of government. And then by doing that, bringing down the size of government, it's a more manageable group of people. It's a smaller group of people. They can do less damage in the economy. And the private sector is big enough to push back where it doesn't look right. Right? Well, and now we're in the case where the federal government's at 25% of the GDP.
Right.
And I think that's a real issue. It's not the bureaucracy that's the issue. It's the fact that we're at 25%. That's too far.
And that's outlays. Right. So each year the government outlays the equivalent of 25% of gross domestic product into the economy. They collect about 19-20%.
Oh, sure.
Right.
But those outlays are what gives them the power and control with all the different NGOs. And we don't want as many outlays.
Well, there's an interesting aspect I think you hit on with focusing on these, NGOs, nonprofits, right? And that gets into something we've seen since really the Reagan administration with the so-called privatization of government, right? And this has really been one of the big issues that's roiled us for the last 45, 50 years, right? Now, the charge has traditionally been that the privatization of government is something that the Republicans do by basically selling off government or taking functions of the government bureaucracy and transferring it to private companies where there's not that government oversight, right? So you have issues. We've seen this most in the military, right? You hire security firms to do stuff, and then there's not the oversight involved with them. I would actually argue that what we've seen over the last 25 or 30 years is a privatization of government on the left, but it's through nonprofits and NGOs,
right?
Which theoretically, nonprofits, you're not supposed to generate a profit, but nobody expects the head of a major nonprofit to work for free, right? So there is some, and I think one of the things we're seeing now is we've had a twofold problem. One, there's the question of how much this has cost. Would it be cheaper for a traditional bureaucrat to handle these services? But the other thing I think you're right on is the same problem we saw with the old privatization of government, that lack of oversight. And the ability of these, it's always been a fear, and in some cases the reality, that some of these privatized companies were used to pursue politicized goals, right? This is why this sort of privatization of government gets so resisted by, say, Tony Blair in the when he comes to office in the late 90s in Britain. He's going to save the budget by privatizing it. This moves it off the government books. I think we're actually in a cycle now going the other way.
Yeah.
Right. With this privatization through nonprofits and whatnot, and people are starting to really ask questions about it.
And there's another fundamental sort of substructure issue to the government being this big and spending money. When the government reaches a certain percentage of the economy, they are effectively making the decision of who are the winners and losers in an economy and a marketplace. That's why fundamentally it goes wrong. So when I say 25% is too much, it's like $1 out of every $4 is being dictated by the government. That has serious impacts on a private business.
Right.
If the government is eating up one sector that maybe I'm a part of, that's going to completely change how my business operates, or if it operates at all. And my argument when I say bureaucracy, not such a bad thing. It's the size that becomes the bad thing. So at 25% of our GDP, basically whatever the government spends money on is where the private sector has to follow along. And we kind of have to chase those dollars, which is really destabilizing. It's a terrible way to do business, and it's eventually going to end up with the economy crashing.
Well, go on.
So I really think that, getting that percentage down, and by the way, 100 years ago, the government size, their income was 3% of the GDP.
Yeah, something like
that. Now
it's
25%, just to give some perspective.
Right.
So it's somewhere along the line, they tipped over that number. And I think it's right around 15%. Right about past 15%, the government starts to exert an unnatural influence.
Right. Well, and you used the word unnatural, and that's what I was going to bring up. Yeah. This is largely to play devil's advocate, but I think there's some validity. Is what you're describing as a bug of the system, where the government is playing a role to determine where the economy goes. I think there is an argument that a lot of people make that's actually a feature. Whether it be,
that it stabilizes the economy.
Well, no, not so much stabilizing, although Keynesian economics, we talked a little bit about this in the tariffs, but I think this is relevant here. I think that it does help. It does help in the infrastructure. We complained about schools. Again, we're looking at the Lovelock post office that's built by a government bureaucracy during the Great Depression that contributes and gives funding back to the local community in a sense, right? You're putting people to work, which is the Keynesian model, because they'll go out and spend goods and keep factory workers employed. This is the basis of this argument that each dollar of federal money spent generates so much more in revenue. But it also provides infrastructure. But a good example, I think, that's sort of parallel and where I think a lot of the Green New Deal, I mean, it's not a coincidence. That's the model they're using, right? Actually comes from Japan, who in the early 70s sort of develops this model of the government sunsetting certain industries that it doesn't think is viable for the future, and then directing resources to sunrising, as they call them, industries that might be the future. So moving Japan away from shipbuilding, for instance, into something like high-tech electronics.
Now that was under some economic pressure because of stagflation, right?
No. This predates stagflation. This has much more to do with.
Did it cause stagflation then?
No. I don't. It's not. It's not related to any of that. No. What it's coming from is Japan, like Europe. We were talking about again last week, is rebuilt
post World War
II, and now is trying to compete in a new world, right? Yeah. So that has nothing to do with the stagflation problems here, which actually come initially. What sparks them is Nixon tries to reintroduce price controls in the 70s to deal with the oil crisis and the inflation, and this starts an unteetering sort of system.
Can I just point out, we just talked about in the Roman Empire how we were excuse me. Shoot, sorry, I just lost my point. Do you remember where you were?
No, I was talking about this idea that we're seeing.
Oh, the price fixing.
The price fixing.
It's so interesting. Thousands of years ago, they keep trying it.
Well, and there are some differences here with the price controls. And I'm using the term because price fixing has a negative connotation.
Yes.
Right. Price controls are something else. And we do see successful examples of price controls, right? Rationing during wartime is effectively a price control.
Yeah, you're right. I think price fixing is actually a term for an illegal crime.
Right.
Yeah.
But
sorry about that.
No. No, I think you're right. It's just an important distinction that the question becomes, and I think really the issue we're dealing with here is I think there's an argument being made that since the government is becoming so large and more importantly has a desire to try to regulate these economies, that's getting us into really dangerous territory.
Yeah.
Because whenever we've seen these, they've universally failed, right? Diocletian's example of price controls is interesting, but the Roman Empire was already in such dire strait, it didn't do anything. But, the example of, for instance, the Soviet Union, which was really based on centralized economies, and very explicitly in many ways taking these World War era administrative models and trying to apply them to an economy of peace, right?
Yeah.
I think really become sort of really damaging. The Soviet Union, these 5-year plans and everything else just really can never recover itself. Now, at times they look strong. And it's interesting, by the time we get to the late 70s, a lot of people were thinking the Soviet Union is actually starting to exceed the West because of these centralized economic controls. What we find after the Soviet Union fails,
mostly facade.
It's facade, and it's creating some real social pushback.
And kind of looking a little bit like that in China.
Well,
too. A little bit with the way they have been pumping their real estate market and their artificial growth rate every year. It seems a little Potemkin village to me.
You're right. Well, and the Potemkin Village syndrome is part of it, but I think the bigger issue is the belief that these centralized economies can actually deal with something as complex as modern economies with high levels of efficiency.
Yeah.
Right. And then the consequences become what happens if they can't maintain that efficiency, right? Theoretically, under a free market system, if that efficiency can't be maintained, you go out of business or somebody else steps in or somebody takes the product away. If you have a government situation, particularly if you have government monopoly of decision making, right? Or some other way to control stuff, monopsony, right? Which is the opposite of monopoly. That means where the government's the only buyer, right? You get situations where I think this efficiency argument becomes very, very vital.
Yeah. And I think we should probably get back to DOGE, the modern day DOGE specifically. I think we've done a good job of laying out just how this has been an issue throughout human history. And mostly I'm just trying to build up to this. I want to respond to the histrionics coming from the Democratic side and try to explain that to conservatives because it is very puzzling. But also look at what is actually going on. And I am the DOGE team. I was watching their interview. I've watched a lot of Elon Musk's interviews, and I mean, they're looking at it the same way that I was looking at it. I wanted as little to do with politics as possible. I very much enjoy being a business person in this country. I've had a fantastic career getting to see all parts of this country and multiple sectors and dealing in highly regulated industries and emerging industries. I love my job. I really did. I wanted nothing to do with politics, and I paid as little attention as possible. Under Trump, the first time, I did notice that a massive influx of investors came in with lots of money. I'd never seen anything quite like it, but I didn't quite tie it to Trump or policy at that time. It wasn't until Biden.
Right. What do you mean by investors? Investors in what?
I work in highly regulated and emerging industries, which are right on the cutting edge. So they're always just opening up new businesses. Tons of people are trying to acquire one of these businesses, get to know this industry, figure out a way to be a part of it. That was my job, was to get them in there. So that inevitably comes with, $10 to $40 million price tag. And under Obama, finding an investor like that was like 1 in 1,000. Under Trump, it was every other day. I got a phone call for a business and wanting to buy it, wanting to put cash somewhere. And it kind of like, I was confused, but I didn't think anything about politics, right? It wasn't until Biden, and then he started shutting down different avenues and redirecting parts of the economy that I saw complete sectors dry up. And I finally put 2 and 2 together. It was policy. And I'm a little embarrassed to admit that in front of everybody. But you look at Elon and DOGE, and it's like, we're business people, and this just didn't make any sense. And we're watching the government close in on us, and we're feeling like there's no way, we have to get in here and see what's happening. And we have. Most of us throughout the Biden industry looked under the hood, and we're like, oh my God. Oh my God, this is out of control. Like, that was our response. So I'm not shocked at the DOGE team, but he has very simple, very manageable goals. He wants to bring federal spending down from $7 trillion to $6 trillion. And it's a reduction of 15%. I completely agree. It just needs to be smaller. Going back to my earlier points, it's not so much the bureaucracy needs to be cleaned up and we need it just to be smaller because it's always going to happen, right?
But I think there's an argument being made that if you shrink government, you have to necessarily shrink the services government provides, right? And that's one of the things that's coming out. Even if we step across Social Security, Medicaid, we've heard for years. Again, going back to the post offices, efforts to shrink the post office is cutting off rural communities. Both of our communities, Elko, I know they shut down the local sorting center in 2010. So right now, if I'm mailing something from my house to a house on the other side of Elko, it goes through Salt Lake. Right, which sounds absolutely absurd.
It is.
But it actually is a money saving when you consider the labor cost. Right, it's cheaper to pay the truck driver to send it to a facility in Salt Lake than it is to have somebody in the machine here to count it. But I think that's part of driving a lot of the concern on the left is that this is going to mean these services disappear. We've seen this with the education department. I don't think the Trump administration is doing this solely for government efficiency. There is some political goals, and we see that most with the education department. But some of this stuff is really looking at, I think from the Democratic side, they're seeing it as the question is, are these services useful? And that's what they're aiming to cut. I think there's an argument on the Republican side. The argument is, okay, we probably need to talk about these services, but even if they're services we need to provide, they need to be ran more efficiently.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And they need to be cheaper. And there's some stuff that can be done to accomplish that fact.
Yes. And I think there's been a hyper focus on the cuts. It really, compared to how the news media is portraying it, especially with the government firings, there's a big to do about all the people that got fired. And it turns out that it was only 0.15% of the workforce that actually got fired. So a lot of these things are getting blown out of proportion. And again, like a 15% drop that's not much. And it's really not that the services will be eliminated. If there truly is a need, the private sector will step up and provide it.
Well,
because they came from somewhere. At one point, the government was smaller and people got along. And the problem is they keep getting bigger, and the problems are also getting bigger. So there is no way forward to keep ratcheting that direction.
Well, but I think one thing, and I don't necessarily disagree with you. I think there is some public sector stuff, but there's also some stuff we probably don't want the public sector to do. And it's stuff that wasn't envisioned, say, when the Constitution goes into effect, right? Flight traffic control is a clear, right? We don't want private sector managing airport air traffic patterns because you have to work across boundary lines. So I have no problem with that. Now, the problem that's gone on with the air traffic controllers is not only did you have those 2 accidents, but people have complained for years. We have, like other parts of the federal government, an antiquated system doing that. And there seems to be no enthusiasm within the bureaucracy to update that system, even as the problems continue to magnify. IRS is another good example. Musk has talked about this, that they're 35 years into investigating how they can move off their computer system. 35, that's more than a generation.
Yeah.
And I think it's perfectly reasonable for somebody to ask as a member of the public, okay, when do we just recognize that the government's not doing anything? Is it 2 generations, 50 years? I mean, that's just absurd.
It is. I'm so glad you brought that up because, like I was saying, the cuts really aren't as big as everyone's making them out to be. But the more important thing is the miscommunications of different government computers. And a really great example that they brought up was they said as many as 40% of Social Security claimants are fraudulent. And a lot of this is like people calling in to change bank account numbers so it reroutes from the original recipient over to this person. Or like a 9-month-old baby took out an SBA loan for like $900,000. And it's simply, if the SBA loan people could communicate with the Social Security people, they could match up and figure out the birth date. Didn't quite make sense. But when they say fraud and abuse, that's kind of more of what they're talking about. Is there's just the miscommunications right over each other all the time. And it's not necessarily that, there's NGOs out there buying jets and taking lavish vacations, which it is happening, but they are doing something to cover their tail.
Well, but
again, this thing about the computers not talking to each other.
Well, but there's I think there's 2 things going on there. First, just a correction. I think what Musk was saying with the 40% is not 40% of Social Security respondents are fraudulent or payees
or the calls that
the calls that they're getting from the centers. They think 40% of those are fraudulent.
That's what I meant to say.
Right. Yeah. So, because that gets back to something we'll talk about. But there's 2 sides. One, I don't think we're ever going to get to a point where you're going to have like everybody accessing the Social Security database. And the reason is Americans have real concerns about privacy and the government collecting massive amounts of data.
Yeah.
And that's where a lot of this siloing went in. But there's no reason for an SBA, Small Business Administration, not to check and ask for a photo ID of the 8-year-old that's getting that.
Well, the 9-month-old, the case was they had the Social Security number, but they couldn't validate the birth date. It didn't come with the birth date. So just the cross-checking of the Social Security number with the birth date would tell us tons. Because there's also, like a certain percentage of people over 115 drawing off the Social Security number. And there's no one that old in this country.
Right.
But the birth date would reveal that.
Well, but this gets into a whole
and I
range.
do appreciate your comment about the data thing, because I do realize that this mess that we got into is mostly because they don't want to be sharing data.
Well, but that's
sensitive information.
But then they passed public regulation, which has, both of us, we both run businesses, right? And we had the FinCEN thing this year, right? Where we supposedly have to give the IRS a photo ID that's kept up to date. So if I move or get a new driver's license, I have to now notify the IRS, or it's something like a $600 a day fine until I do so. And this is supposed to solve this stuff of 8-year-olds getting loans. And it's like, a bank. When's the last time you heard of a bank giving an 8-year-old a loan? right?
Well, I just got really annoyed at that because they go through all of these, they make me go through all these hoops to prove that I'm an American citizen and I'm doing the right thing and I am not, like, my business isn't benefiting terrorists and all this stuff. And meanwhile, there's like millions of people pouring across the border. We don't know who they are, nothing. They're like, fine, come on in. But you producing employment and money in our country, what are you doing? Like, sorry.
Well, and this gets into the ideological dimension, but I do want to go back to the Social Security thing because again, I've talked a couple times here about that joint speech that Trump gave to Congress and how un-Trumpian the speech that was, and him making the distinction between this fraud and waste issue. And the Social Security is an interesting one because one of the things that struck me about this is, is immediately, as he points out, there's 5 million people, supposedly over 115 or so in the Social Security database. But the initial report, the report from day one, is what the DOGE team found is there's these 5 million people over than 115 where the death date isn't filled out in this database they looked at. Now, the immediate response from the left was, well, there's this form that every mortician or somebody that signs off on a death certificate has to fill out that this makes sure those Social Security payments are stopped. There probably is, and we'll sidestep the issue of how efficiently the government processes forms. It's quite possible there's another database in the Social Security that's actually cutting the checks.
Yeah.
But here's what I'm wondering about. You have this supposedly, and it sounds to me like it's like a master database that the other ones reference. So even if they're not paying the checks off this database, you have that death field that's not filled out for 5 million people who obviously are not alive. How much is that impacting other policies? Yeah. So for instance, we've heard for years Social Security is about to go bankrupt.
Is that based on all those?
Is that based on 5 million claimants that are going to have to be paid for that don't exist?
Yeah.
Right? We don't know. And it's quite possible that the Social Security Administration isn't drawing off that master database. But the fact that you have a basic field structure of data that's not being maintained is a problem.
Yeah.
Right? And it doesn't mean you're going to get rid of the program, but it's an issue that needs to be fixed because sometimes somebody's going to look at that and make a mistake.
Yeah. And I think the big takeaway people should have is that yes, the DOGE team is making some cuts to try to reduce some of the waste and abuse, but mostly, and I laughed when Elon said this, he said he's tech for the president, he's IT for the president. And I didn't really understand what he was talking about fully. I didn't fully appreciate it until yesterday when I saw the DOGE team interview with Brett Baer. I didn't quite understand just how much fraud and abuse was being enabled by the miscommunication of the computers. So the majority of the cuts aren't going to be actually cuts to citizens and businesses. Most of the cuts are going to come from eliminating the communication problem. And I was like, wow. I mean, I wish people really understood that. And so I really wanted to nail it home on this podcast. Is like, this isn't really slash and burn. This is more of like, let's eliminate some of these weird things going on so we can have a better comprehensive picture of how our government's functioning and cut out the places where there's fraud occurring.
Well, and I think it's not just the IT. And the IT thing is interesting because one of the things as it came out, because there were immediate challenges to DOGE, right? Nobody expected it to get started as fast as it did. Right. So there's immediate challenges, and come to find out, DOGE is actually bundled under an Obama era law that was designed to look at computer systems. So technically, he is tech support, right?
So he's carrying out Obama's. Boy, don't tell that to the left.
Well, but no, that's the legal justification for this. But outside these computer systems, there's a whole range of stuff that I think that I actually don't think there's a lot of abused or fraudulent government services. There are a lot, and with the terms of particularly illegal immigration, some other stuff. But I think the fundamental problem is that these services they're providing are really overly complicated, and it's not just because of computers and cost. If we could talk about a fellow podcast, Jon Stewart's The Weekly Show podcast, just a couple of days ago, that interview he did with Ezra Klein, where they're going through an example of what we started talking about with infrastructure, right? This effort of the Biden administration to build rural broadband.
He's like all the steps. The internal review and the federal review and the open public comment. I was like, welcome to my world. This is why business people are getting involved in politics, because this is exactly what we have to deal with. It is obnoxious.
Right. And in this case, here we are 4 years into a program, which I think a lot of people out of all the stuff with that supposed infrastructure bill, right, you've been quite critical of the so-called social infrastructure embedded in it. Here's one of the physical infrastructures that probably a lot of people had not a lot of problem with, right? This is something that's really needed is rural broadband access. And, the federal government can build infrastructure, right? They can build post offices if they put their mind to it, right? And here we are 4 years into this project, not 1 meter of infrastructure has been built for rural broadband, and only 3 programs are even at the final approval stage.
No, don't get me started on electric car charging stations.
Well, that's another example of where this has gone totally wrong, and where it's really a question of why are these delays in there? And a lot of it's because of this overweening need for this follow a process that's supposed to provide transparency, but the process is so complicated that not only does it prevent the transparency that it's designed to promote, it also is just making it impossible to get everything done, right? So people just throw their hands up and like, the hell with it.
Yeah, which, I mean, that's kind of the point. If you're on the person in power side, is you want to get so big that you're untouchable. That's why the problem occurs in the first place. Anyone in any kind of power or wealth always thinks if they had a little bit more, they'd be a little bit safer. And it's just a normal human being thing to do. And what I'm trying to communicate is that this isn't some big anomaly that's happening in our country right now. This is a normal thing that we go through. And I don't know if you want, do we have time for the quotes?
Well, if you want to give the quotes, okay. I actually sort of, yes, there are some needs to protect positions and sort of the usual bureaucratic sort of, protecting my domain sort of stuff. I think it's actually a much bigger problem where there's a perception that anything well, let's go back to Voltaire. I don't know if you've ever read Voltaire's Candide.
Voltaire, I have not.
Okay. Well, this is his big satirical sort of novel. And one of the characters, part of what he's arguing about
is... Remind me what era he's from.
Oh, 18th century.
Okay.
Right. So Enlightenment, lead up to the French Revolution. He dies before the French Revolution happens.
Thank
but anyway,
God.
but he's actually arguing against sort of a pre-Enlightenment Leibnizian optimism with this character called Professor Pangloss, which is his tutor. And they go on these sort of black adventures, satirical adventures across Europe. And all Dr. Pangloss can say is, oh, this is the best of all possible worlds. This is the best of all possible worlds, right? We have piracy in the Mediterranean, but it's okay because this is the best of all possible worlds. We have the government beating people in the streets. Well, that's okay because it's the best of all possible worlds. I always thought that in many ways, one of the problems we're dealing with is an adherence to an idea that the government bureaucracy that exists now, because it was built supposedly to address issues, is the best of all possible worlds. That it can't be cut or touched because that means these services disappear and everything's needed. And if it's not working, we just need more. And it's getting to the point that this system is ossifying. Right. Because of the more that keeps being added without looking like, okay, do we really need these 4 or 5 different agencies, right? Yeah. Does the Department of Education, for instance, have to have a whole department managing a food stamp program that before Department of Education existed was managed by the USDA and is continuing largely to be ran by the USDA, not just with the Department of Education oversight, right? Nobody's talking about getting rid of the school lunch programs because they're ran by another part of the government. It's getting rid of the sort of secondary oversight, which one could ask, does that need to exist?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and I do think we do need to get to some work as a country. I'm not sure I would say as a civilization, but we do need to figure out when you have a centralized government, just how much of the economy it should be influencing. So what percentage of the GDP is kind of like that max percentage. And it changes actually quite a bit. If you look at, where's that chart for income tax rates? What's interesting to me is we started income taxes in 1913.
We'll put this up on the screen so you can see what we're looking at here.
And up until then, the government was less than 3% of the GDP. And then they implemented income tax. And in the very first few decades of income tax, they were wildly all over the place. It went as high as 94% in some certain times of war. I can't remember. World War II.
Yeah.
I remember in 1944, it got as high as 94%. It kind of mimicked a tariff at first, a little bit, because they were just implementing the high income tax rates during a time of war, and then they drop it back down, and then they bring it back up. So it was kind of weird how, but anyways, the last few decades it's kind of settled out at about 35 to 40% is our income tax rate. So what's interesting about this chart to me is that the government can kind of move all over the place in terms of size and its influence. And I kind of like the beginning where the government grew to the size it needed to be for wartime. And then afterwards it shrunk back down. And now we're kind of at this place where we're in peace. So it's just always ratcheting out bigger and bigger. And they're finding more and more reasons to justify it. But like I said, the outcomes have gone downhill. So we've reached a point of diminishing returns, and we really need to figure out what is the maximum amount of GDP that we want to let our government be control of.
Well, and again, I think you're all going to see that shift, and maybe that's not the best measure. The best measure, and again, I want to go back to this John Stewart thing just briefly, because Ezra Klein, or one of them, makes this absolutely brilliant quote. Ezra Klein is writing this, co-author of this new book, Abundance.
It's hilarious. You really should look this up.
Yeah, and we'll link it on the website because it really is good. But he was like, the true measure of the success of the government is the people it helps, not the number of processes that it follows. And that's where we've sort of got off, I think, right? That the processes have become more important to any type of rational outcome, right? They don't match. And is DOGE the best way? It's the best way I've sort of seen anybody come up with to try to apply, because certainly waiting for 35 years to decide which computer system you're going to adopt. I mean, the Big Bang Theory resolved the whole Xbox One versus PS5 or PS3 debate in 30 minutes, right? That's a fictional example, but 35 years, that's just astounding, right? Yeah. So,
and I think if nothing else, DOGE will have a chilling effect on, I think a lot of people got super comfortable with just getting huge government handouts and not having anyone really check in and see what they're spending money on. If nothing else, this will put a little bit of a chill on that behavior. People will be a little bit less enthusiastic about just spending money on whatever. It's like you said, nonprofits aren't supposed to make a profit, but I mean, I roll my eyes at that, because you can buy a jet and you can get a huge salary and you can buy a mansion and you can throw corporate parties and basically reflecting a millionaire's lifestyle while not taking a millionaire's salary. It's just, the whole thing is really ridiculous. And I just think that if nothing else, DOGE will put a chilling effect on that.
Well, we'll see, because there are, for instance, here in the Nevada State Legislature, there's a number of bills that are looking at finding alternative funding for these nonprofits if they're federal funding, and they say that right in the bill.
Yeah.
Right. So I think a better way of looking at this is, I don't know if it's going to have a chilling effect. I think it is going to be a rollicking discussion we're going to be having over the next, at least through the rest of the Trump administration, about this. And in some ways, I think a conversation is what we should have. Hopefully it doesn't spill over into anything serious. But, like I said, we've covered a lot here today. So,
and by the way, Nevada went through this process a couple of years ago. Our comptroller, Andy Matthews.
Controller. There's a difference between comptroller and controller. He's controller.
Controller. It's an elected position, isn't it? Or is it appointed?
but there's a variation, and Andy's gotten on me a couple times. Well, controller, right?
Anyways, so Andy Matthews he really wanted to make the finances of Nevada transparent, and he made a website that allows you to go on and see where everything's being spent, and kind of the opposite of the way that the federal DOGE played out. I watched Andy do that. I thought it was incredible. It was that's such a great service. Everybody loved it. No one had anything bad to say about it. And then you saw the DOGE on the federal level, and the exact opposite thing happened.
Well, and I think the problem is the state controller, although he's sharing all this data, doesn't have the power to cut and make decisions on the services.
Oh, sure.
And I think that's part, the whole reason he did this, and Nevada Checkbook's what it's called.
Shedding light on it.
It's shedding light.
Huge.
So, like I said, I think there's a lot here, and we'll probably do a couple more episodes on aspects of this if you're up to it. So, but in the meantime, if you have any questions, you can visit us at 775alive.com. Send the questions to info@775alive.com. We'll go ahead and if they're interesting enough, go ahead and try to answer them to you. But until then, we'll see you around the 775. I'm Scott Gaborski.
I'm Crystal Newton.
Have a good one.